Hello, everyone, and welcome to already the 8th episode of EUCOPE's Life Science College, which is, of course, part of our broader EUCOPE webinar series. Good afternoon to all of you, and also a good morning to those who join us in the United States, as I know that some of you are. I see that there are still some people dropping in, so I'll suggest that we kick off the meeting in just a few minutes. In the meantime, a warm welcome to you all. Also, a warm welcome to my fantastic panelists, who I will introduce in just a few seconds. By means of introduction, my name is Leander Vranken, and basically within EUCOPE, I'm mostly tasked with our digital health portfolio. So hence, that's why you are listening to me here today. And today, as you know, we're also going to talk about the, very ambitious, I must say, European Health Data Space Regulation. It's a legislation that basically has far-reaching implications, especially it's going to determine how health data is going to be lawfully shared. So it's also quite a promising regulation, especially in the development of innovative drugs, personalized drugs. But there are, of course, also some areas that need extra attention. But before we delve into any of that, it's also an absolute pleasure to welcome my fantastic panelists today. First and foremost, of course, my colleague and Secretary General of EUCOPE, Alexander Natz, to whom I will give the word just shortly. And Alex and I have been following this, the proposal and now the legislation since its initial inception. I would also like to welcome Zinovia Chatzidimitriadou. And she's the Senior Managing Associate at SIDLEY Austin. And I must say, Zina is also a true expert on matters of digital health, also mainly with a focus on regulatory protections and IP rights. Also AI, which is of course going to be very relevant for this webinar as well. And together with Zinovia, we'll be looking at the actual legislative text and discuss some of its implications. So thank you, Zina, for being here. And of course, we also have Federico Pisani. He is the Senior Government Affairs and Policy Specialist at the biotech company of Illumina, also a EUCOPE member. And I must say, Federico also has an excellent knowledge of the EHDS, especially what it means for the pharmaceutical industry. And I've been also closely working with Federico during the initial inception of the EHDS legislation. So many thanks, Federico, for being here. And last but not least, we also have the regulator on board, so the European Commission, Mr. Ove Langveld. He is the policy officer at the digital health unit of DG Sante, and Ove was also part of the European Commission's negotiating team during the trialogues when the Council and Parliament and Commission were negotiating the file. Especially with the EHDS now moving into the implementation phase, it's also good to have the Commission there. So essentially, together with Ove, we'll also be looking at where the file is going, the timelines, consultations, opportunities, etc., etc. So before we jump to you, Alex, first a couple of housekeeping rules quickly from my side. So we want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So please leave your comments and questions in the chat. There's also a separate Q&A section in which you can send questions directly to the panelists, but also to the public. So we can always pick up your questions, and also be aware that this webinar is being recorded, so you can watch it back anytime you want. So that's enough from me. I would like to invite Alex to say a few words before we dive into today's material. Please go ahead, Alex.
Thank you very much, Leander. And let me first of all say a big thank you to you and the EUCOPE team, also to Cecile and everyone involved in EUCOPE for organizing this webinar. It was Leander and me, and together with Oliver, our colleague, we had a discussion some months ago in Brussels, and we talked about now what's the next step. It's all about implementation now of the European Health Data Space, and how do we support our companies in doing so. Because there's a lot of things which now need to be prepared for the real introduction of the European Health Data Space. And this is what we actually want to do in this webinar today. It's really a great pleasure to have the Commission on board, to have a member on board from Illumina, but also to have Zina on board from SIDLEY Austin, where we hosted a couple of webinars together already with SIDLEY Austin. So it's a great pleasure to really talk today about implementation, what needs to be done in the next couple of years. There's a lot of homework, I think, also from the company perspective. When I heard the Commission speaking the first time about the European Health Data Space some years ago, I really thought like this is a big move and an important move forward for Europe when it comes to sharing of data, sharing of health data, but also to really make sure that Europe is front running when it comes to becoming a competitive market, a positive market for research and development. Because as we all know, more and more, it's all about data, access to data. And so it's really a very important piece of legislation where I don't think we know everything yet about the potential, but also the obligations involved. And this is where we want to shed some light in this webinar. What are the obligations for the companies, but also what is the potential? And also to hear from the Commission and also from the company perspective, is it really fit for purpose to make Europe more competitive when it comes to research and innovation in pharmaceuticals and medical devices and beyond? So it's really a great pleasure. And once again, a big thank you to you, Leander, for hosting us today, for setting up the webinar. It's been a great outcome, I think, and also to Cecile for supporting us here in setting this up. And that's it from my side. I don't want to be in the way to very interesting presentations and a panel discussion, but the floor is yours. Back to you, Leander.
Thank you very much, Alex. And indeed, you already touched upon quite some very relevant topics. We're going to share a couple of slides with the audience. This will also help us to navigate through the material of today. So we're just going to put those slides up in a sec. Yep, indeed, implementing the European Health Data Space. And this webinar is all about the journey from regulation to implementation. So indeed, we have a legislative text. So there is already a regulation, but this, of course, also needs to be implemented. Quickly to the agenda. This shouldn't be taking no longer than a minute. Next slide, please. So yeah, first a little bit of an introduction to the EHDS very quickly. Why is it relevant for pharmaceutical companies? As I mentioned, there is a legislative text, so there's a legal framework which we need to go through. We're mostly going to focus on the secondary use. So in order to understand how the EHDS is implemented, we need to understand its definitions, its concepts, the obligations, and there are also a few areas that we really would like to zoom into: IP, trade secret, safeguards, the opt-out, of course, which was a very controversial topic during the trilogues, and before that also international data transfer. So we all have a look at the actual text that we now have, and then we move on to implementation in 2025. We're going to look at the TEDAS 2, which is the joint action where secondary use, or at least a harmonized approach to secondary use, is being worked out by the Commission, by member states, by other actors, stakeholders involved. Very, very relevant and important. And of course, we also have the industry perspective to reflect on the pharmaceutical industries side of things. Next slide, please. So very quickly, this should not take longer than 2 minutes. The European Health Data Space is, of course, already an upcoming regulation, as it sets out, of course, rules, common standards, also practices, I must add, and an infrastructure and a governance framework for the use of electronic health data for healthcare, research, innovation, and policymaking. So there are three important elements in this. First, of course, is to give individuals better access and control of their own health data, but also unleash the full potential by fostering a genuine single market for digital health services and products, but also to ensure a consistent framework for the use of individuals' health data for research and innovation, also policymaking and regulatory activities. So large and high quality data sets will soon be able to access for several purposes. Next slide, please. So the objective essentially is really the effective usage of health. Essentially, the EHDS is twofold. So there's the primary use and the secondary use. The primary use really focuses on the relationship between you and the healthcare provider. It also provides individuals to control their own health data, easily access to their health data. And it does this by the European Electronic Health Record Exchange format, which essentially is the harmonized format of how health data will be shared. And this is all with the idea to foster a single market for data. But we're also going to look at the reuse of health data, which essentially is facilitates the research and innovation by essentially allowing access to large and high quality data sets for indeed the purpose of research and innovation. And this, of course, is something we definitely need to look into, as it provides a whole lot of benefits that we'll be soon looking into. Next slide, please. So why is it relevant? Essentially, as a pharmaceutical company or research-based pharmaceutical industry, you will become part of the EHDS ecosystem. So you will be a future health data holder, which means you're subject to the rules. The European health data space is relevant because indeed it fosters innovation. So it develops new and innovative healthcare solutions, really, as I mentioned before, by facilitating the access to high quality data sets for research and innovation purposes. And this, of course, can drive the discovery of innovative therapies, solutions also for small and mid-sized companies that are already heavily relying on innovation to stay afloat. But also real-world evidence generation. I think also the community that benefits maybe probably the most from this legislation is the rare disease community, as data on rare diseases is already quite rare by default. So having one common access point to rare disease data for research innovation also hopefully bolsters research being done in this area. And also competitive, of course. So it could, access to health data sets for research innovation also hopefully increases the competitive advantage and greater international resilience. We're almost there. We're just quickly going to the implementation timeline. Next slide, please. So what can we expect? Already quite some action we saw in 2024. So there is already a deal on the EHDS compromise text. So we have a legislative text. We will look at it in just a second. And there's also formal adoption already by the European Parliament. So that means that in December, by the end of this year, we will see adoption and entry into force. That all has to do with the fact that the file is still in corrigendum, which basically means that we're going through translation and it's going through a legal review to make sure that it's watertight, so to speak. And from that moment onwards, we have that the EHDS will start to apply in a phased approach. So indeed, in December 2026, so in 2 years, the regulation is already applicable, but the secondary use part will already be applicable in 4 years after it went into force. And then also in 8 years, we have already our first progress report, and in 10 years, there is the overall evaluation. So in 8 years already, a first progress report. Federico, maybe quickly, is that, it's a very important file, maybe for overall evaluation in 10 years, maybe a little bit too long, or do you think we could stick with this timeline?
So first of all, thank you so much, Leander, Alexander, EUCOPE, for inviting me and organizing this webinar, and good afternoon, everyone. So indeed, I think that based on experience and the many exchanges with experts and colleagues from across the industry, I would argue that an 8-year timeline for the first progress report and 10-year period for the first evaluation might seem a bit lengthy, especially given the rapid pace of technological advancement in healthcare, the necessary regulatory flexibility to maintain an agile regulatory framework, and the required levels of investment in the public and private sectors. So if we take genomics as an example of fast-paced innovation, over the past decade, we have seen significant advancement in genome sequencing technologies, dramatic reduction in the cost of sequencing, integration of genomic data in clinical practice, which have accelerated the adoption of precision medicine, enabling more effective treatments and better patient outcomes. So given the rapid pace of innovation in genomics and other fast-paced areas, a long evaluation period might delay the integration of cutting-edge applications into the European space, potentially limiting its benefits for healthcare in Europe more broadly. Additionally, I would also add that shorter interim reports could provide a necessary insight to ensure industry and public investments are being directed effectively and that early challenges are addressed in a timely manner. Short, I think it's, I would take the opportunity to plug the idea for more frequent assessments. In the end, this would certainly benefit the EHDS in order to make it relevant and effective in driving innovation and improving healthcare in areas where development happens extremely fast.
Thank you very much, Federico. I saw over your hand risen. Please go ahead.
Yeah, just maybe a small addition and kind of a bit more context. As indeed you mentioned, we're currently in the lawyer linguist revision. So basically taking text that was the subject of the midnight handshake photo and basically cleaning it up a bit. So it's not going to change the substance, but numbering and basically general cleanup of the text. And once that is done, we'll get the final signatures on it, so to say, have the publication in the official journal. I tend to be a bit more cautious about that and just say around the end of the year. And for adoption, and then publication in the official journal. And that's then where the clock for all of the points on the slides will start running. And one important thing is that there's quite a long transition period until the obligations will actually become applicable. So it is +4 years, let's say, for the main parts in secondary use, +6 for some of the remaining data categories. So while 8 and 10 sounds very long, please remember that by that time, by the +8, we'll have 4 years of experience for a big chunk of the secondary use chapter, 2 years for the remaining parts, such as genomics. Similarly, on the primary use side, it's also 2 or 4 years, depending on which categories we're talking about. And that kind of fits in the normal 3 to 4 years of actual experience and application that we usually have when doing an evaluation. There's also 20 more seconds. In the preparation for the text, we will have annual progress reports starting basically next year on how the preparations are going. So how far we on Commission side are in setting up infrastructures, how far member states have been setting up some of the authorities that they need to set up. So there is quite a controlled process on making sure that implementation is on track and also relevant. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries. Thank you very much. Already quite some talk about implementation, but I suggest that we quickly go to the next slide, as we also going to look at the legal framework now. As I indeed mentioned, we have a text. Yeah, Sina, I would like to give the floor to you. Before we go into implementation, we also need to, of course, understand a bit about what has been agreed and what is the legal framework.
Of course. Thank you so much, Leander. And again, thank you for having me here with you today. It's such a pleasure to share the panel with those great speakers. I think the audience will be relieved to know that we will not have a dry citation of the law. That's supposed to be an interactive panel discussion, and indeed Q&A from you as well. I'm sorry, we appear to have a fire alarm in the building. I will have to go on mute for a bit. Leander, would it be worth moving to other section while we're resolving the fire alarm?
Sorry, you want to, Zina, you want to move to the other section already while we wait for the fire alarm?
It might be the case. It might not be. I'm very sorry for the interruption. We just had a
no
fire
worries.
alarm. But it might not go ahead. It seems that it's stopped now. So I will continue unless we're kicked out of the building again. So the following slide, I think, if we can go back to the slide sharing, it just had a snapshot of the EHDS regulation as a whole. So of course, this discussion will be focusing, thank you very much, will be focusing on secondary use data and on key provisions of what it means for the industry and implementation. But we would be amiss not to mention the focus on primary use, which is the right of individuals to access their data and therefore assist cross-border provision of healthcare. And that is chapter 2. And also the emphasis on new rules to ensure that electronic health records are secure and interoperable to create trust. So now the next section onwards will focus on the compulsory data access sharing mechanism provided for secondary use purposes. So if we move on to the next slide, we will start with the who, what, why, and how. I'm very sorry, the follow-up
emergency is now over.
Okay.
The emergency is now over. Thank you for your cooperation.
I'm very sorry about this interruption. I'm sure you're all very happy I'm safe. So starting with what data can be shared for secondary use. Now, the data sets in scope for the sharing for secondary purposes, as you will see, and many of you will know, are very broadly defined. I'm not going to go through the slides in detail, but you will see that data including registry data, genomic data, and other omic data, which are very sensitive, data from clinical trials, data from medical devices fall under the scope of secondary use sharing. Now, those data are key for research. A lot of those data up until now tend to be siloed. They tend to be spread across multiple countries. And of course, it's great to be able to benefit from them for research purposes. I'm sure I would love to hear from my fellow panelists in a bit about what they think about the way those data are defined or even understood among different data holders. Interestingly, we see that member states may introduce stricter measures and additional safeguards for certain types of data, including biobank data and genomic data. I'm sure Federico will have views about those. And equally, as we'll see in a little bit about data holders, they will be required to communicate to health data access bodies on a systematic basis what data sets they hold and what data sets they can share with the general public. And so that's why it's quite important that everybody's on the same page as to how these categories of data are defined and when they can be shareable. Now, before I move on to the next slide, I was wondering if anyone from the panel or even the audience would have any remarks to raise about the types of data or the way the health data have been set out in the legislation. I'm not sure I see a question.
Yes.
Sorry. There you go.
We have I think we have a couple of questions in the chat. So what will be the obligations on non-European electronic health record systems? Yeah.
That's a very good question. And I think I was thinking of covering on the next page, but indeed that has been the subject of a lot of discussion. At the moment, even though the territorial scope is not very clearly defined in the text that we have,
yeah,
it is understood that data holders established in the EU would not be permitted to share data collected from non-EU sites with EU regulators or other parties for the broad purposes of secondary use. And indeed, we see as one data category being data from biobanks. And we all know that EU-based biobanks could very well have data from non-EU subjects who might not have provided their consent for that broad sharing envisaged by the EHDS. So under the scenario, it really needs to be clear what data falls to be established, and if data of ex-EU subjects that are in mixed data sets would be subject to or even allowed to be shared under the EHDS. This at the moment is not very clear. On the one hand, we might have the obligations under EHDS to share all the data. On the other hand, data holders could find themselves in breach of EU laws if they end up sharing data for which they don't have the consent to share it. So equally, it's a little bit unclear whether the regulation applies to sponsors or data holders outside the EU. We think that this is not the case. We think that it only applies to data holders and sponsors within the EU. And in this case, it should also not apply to data being processed, the data coming from outside of the EU. But again, I think we would welcome certainty from the Commission unless Ove already you might have a view on that.
I can already jump in a bit on the definition. So this, where does it apply? Territorial scope and who's the holder? So in the holder definition, and because you also mentioned biobanks and similar examples, I'm focusing more than on the personal data case. There we have that when we're talking about personal data, the holder is always a controller. So let's say, EU-based processor for a controller outside they're not a controller, so in that sense, they would be out of scope of that definition, so they don't have to make it available. The other one, it's always interesting how to read questions, and also who or what exactly is the addressee of certain obligations. So this is on the holder side. Now a non-European electronic health record system, if we're talking about obligations on the system, like a health record system, as in, for example, a patient management system that a hospital would procure to manage the info of the people to whom they provide treatment. There we have rules in the text on making such systems available on the EU market. And there it is basically, well, if you sell them here, you need to comply with the standards that are here. Similar as basically other product legislation, where you sell a car in Europe, it needs to comply with European emissions and safety standards. So the similar logic as there.
Thank you so much for confirming, Ove. That's very important insights. Now, I think we can move on to the next slide about who will be required to share data. And here we have the concept of a data holder. Ove just said that indeed they would be defined as controllers. So when we talk about personal data, any natural or legal person that has the right or obligation to process personal health data as a controller or joint controller would fall under the definition, or any party that would be able to make available electronic health data because, for example, they're developing a product or a service in that space. And of course, that would include pharmaceutical companies and medical device companies who develop such products. Now, there is an exemption for individual researchers and micro enterprises from the data holder definition, so that there wouldn't be a disproportionate burden on these entities to make available the data. And again, we have this discussion about holders based outside of the EU or data collected from non-EU sites. If we move on to the next slide, we have the definition of why. So why would such data, for what purposes can such data be shared for secondary use purposes? And we have a list of purposes for which secondary use of health data would be allowed. Scientific research is of key interest, and it is to be interpreted in a very broad manner. We have, I think, the last bullet point, a list of activities that would be permissible, that would make it permissible to request and therefore disclose such data. But we also have prohibited uses for which secondary use would not be allowed. So we have marketing purposes or decisions that could be detrimental to a person or a group of persons. So those would not be permissible ways and grounds to request such data. Equally, when receiving access to health data users would not be allowed to attempt to re-identify individuals or give access to third parties that are not mentioned in the data permit issue. And the last bucket of definitions before we move on to the more juicy topics is who can request access to health data and how. So the how is a request from data users. The next slide, please, if that's possible. Health data users are, again, a broad set of entities. It could be individuals, it could be EU institutions, research institutions, and private companies. And interestingly, health data users from third countries can also make an application to access data from a health data access body for secondary use purposes. But this is only either if their country of establishment participates in the EHDS under a Commission decision, or if the country allows EU applicants to have access to their own data on similar terms as per the EHDS, again, according to a Commission decision that has to establish this basis. Now, data users have to get, they can only be granted access for up to 5 years under a data permit. And at the end of the research that they perform, 18 months rather, after the end of the research they perform based on that data, data users would have to publish a report with the results of that research. So it's quite interesting to see that obligation and how it ties in, whether it would be protected and what information that could reveal. Now, interestingly, the gold standard of data that data users would be supposed to have would be anonymized data. To the extent that they expect that pseudonymized data is required, they would have to justify this in their application. And the legal basis for accessing the data would be under Article 6 of the GDPR. If the data user is a public body, it would be the performance of a public interest task, or for other companies, that would be a legitimate interest, and they would have to justify which of those legal bases they meet. Now, enough with the dry legal stuff. We go to some of the key provisions. And one question front of mind. Oh, great question. Who will define and pay the anonymization costs? Yes, that's a great question. Again, this is not extremely clearly written. It's suggested that anonymization has to take place as soon as possible in the chain of secondary use. And in practice, that would have to be the data holder, because that they would be the first actor in the chain of data sharing. But the recitals do not exclude health data access bodies performing this task. Equally, there is a provision in the recitals that says that the health data access bodies should support holders that are small and medium-sized enterprises. And so it's also possible that data holders might also participate in the anonymization of data, either upfront or whether they might consider that some data should be anonymized that hasn't already been anonymized. And a very interesting question as well about who bears the cost. It would have to be assumed potentially that the data holder would have this burden upfront. But again, it all depends potentially how that will be maybe clarified through guidance, or what the specific circumstances of the data sharing request might be. Now, moving to IP rights, the sensitive data and commercially confidential data. The industry and a lot of actors were relieved to see a new article in the final text that sets out very detailed provisions about how IP right protected data and trade secrets could be identified, and the measures that can be taken or need to be taken by health data access bodies to protect the relevant data that they identify as sensitive, and also a possibility to refuse access to such data. This means essentially that we put all of our eggs in one basket, and the responsibilities on the health data access bodies to act as gatekeepers to assess what constitutes commercially confidential information. And the data holder does not have the right to have the final say or to refuse access to that data. We have definitions broadly aligned with the Data Act. I say broadly because one of the key, I think, protections under the Data Act from disclosure, which is when the requester is developing a competing product, this safeguard is missing from the final legal text of the European health data space. So it will be interesting to see how health data access bodies, or even perhaps at a centralized level, secondary legislation might or might not reflect this safeguard from disclosure as sensitive, commercially confidential or IP right data. It's a very interesting topic, and I will soon pass on to Federico for his thoughts on that and Ove. But another point I wanted to discuss here is the fact that the health data access bodies will make available information on what requests they have received from health data users, what permits they have granted, and the results communicated to health data users by them. And the protection that we see here on what health data access bodies can disclose does not extend to the information relating to data users. In other words, the kind of information a data user could request and the kind of output they produce would not be seen as IP right to be protected under this provision. And that's interesting because that could reveal a commercial research strategy of an entity performing research based on the data. So now I would love to hand to Federico to have some initial thoughts about what you think about those protections. Do you think they're far-reaching enough to protect legitimate interests? Is there anything you would like to see in these provisions to better safeguard the data that might be sensitive?
Thank you, Zina. Thank you for the excellent presentation, first of all. So, rebounding on your last question, I would start by saying that striking a balance between innovation and trust in the framework is one of the most difficult things that's been tried during the legislative process and will come back to the table during the implementation phase. And it's something that we'll need the Commission to provide guidance on, as there are still a number of confusing and gray areas to be clarified. A key concern for us would certainly be the amount of responsibilities that are being put on the shoulders of health data access bodies. And the question remains whether they will be provided the means and the resources to develop the capabilities and capacity, both technical and legal, to be able to address the volume of requests that they will face in the future. So there is a little bit of a trial and error as we can expect, process that we can expect in the future during this implementation phase. But striking this balance will be an essential part to see whether the entire framework will actually succeed in the end. At the end of the day, if this improvement will amount to enough protection in terms of IP rights, trade secrets, safeguards, it will represent an incentive for companies to share high-value sensitive data and thus accelerate the entire engine of drug development, personalized medicine, AI-driven healthcare solutions. So it will be essential to respond to this question, but as things stay, as things are at the moment, I think there is a lot of unknown, including whether there is a capacity to actually absorb this new workload.
Thank you very much, Federico. Zina, I suggest that we are running a bit out of time. I suggest that we slowly move forward to the next topic already, and that we can talk about the implementation process. and the presentation from the European Commission, and I'm sure that we also there touch upon the IP issue there. Again, as EUCOPE, we also believe that at least guidance should be given on how health data access bodies are going to interpret IP and trade secrets safeguards. Of course, big issue for us. I'll suggest we put up the presentation on, and then Zina, we can maybe quickly go through the opt-out and to international transfers before we go to OIS.
Great. So I think if we have the presentation back up on our screen in a couple of minutes, we'll talk about the opt-out, which is a new provision added. Essentially, it's the right of individuals to object to sharing their health data for secondary use. Now, each member state will provide their own mechanism for the opt-out, and the opt-out could still be overridden for purposes of important public interest if that data is needed for scientific research or important public interest. Again, a controversial provision potentially, but what is key to make it work is the standardization and harmonization. Because for every data holder to navigate different opt-out systems in each member state could be burdensome and could lead to fragmentation of the secondary use sharing regime. So it's key to have a clear way of combining data sets from different member states. So this is why it's very important to see a mechanism working in the same way across member states as far as possible. We have a bit of a food for thought in the last question, whether the fact that member states could introduce stricter measures and safeguards for certain data categories like biobanks, genetic data, and so on, could be introducing an opt-in through the back door per se. I will move on to the international data transfers, and then I will pass on to the other speakers who I'm sure will have many thoughts about the opt-out mechanism as well. Now, in terms of data localization, the obligation is only at the moment on health data access bodies to store the data they process in the EU or in a third country that provides adequate protection under the GDPR. Now, we have the territorial scope. We briefly discussed how we're not very clear on it, so I won't repeat that. But we talk about the transfers of personal data and non-personal data. Transfers of personal data are already subject to the GDPR. Member states have the right to restrict international transfers of personal health data beyond perhaps conditions imposed by the GDPR. What is more interesting is this new category of the non-personal data, and that could even include data that has been anonymized and which is therefore no longer subject to the GDPR. And in the next slide, we see how this new concept of highly sensitive non-personal data is defined. For non-personal health data that are held by health data access bodies and which are made available for secondary use, they will be considered as highly sensitive if there is a risk of re-identification through means that go beyond those reasonably likely to be used. And for this non-personal data, we see the category set out on the slide under the Data Governance Act. For this non-personal data, the Commission can set out protective measures in implementing legislation. On the other hand, in terms of international transfers of non-personal data, both health data access bodies and data users are under a duty to prevent international transfers where this transfer would either conflict with an EU or national law, or they have a limitation of transfers of non-personal data pursuant to foreign court orders or administrative decisions, unless the legal regime meets certain standards. So those are broadly the provisions on international transfers, and I will pass on to Ove for the implementation.
Yes, now also really hello from me on my side. Yes, I'll then jump into the implementation here. Could also say plenty of things on the previous ones, but indeed, as Leander rightly said, we're all so interested and excited about the topic that we speak more than what was budgeted. So let's keep those for the Q&A session at the end. One point which was mentioned already is indeed the EHDS regulation is written in a quite high level way. There's a lot of implementation work and guidance needed below. So where is this going to come from? Both on the kind of practical level and on the legal side. So we are or have already been working with member states, for example, in the Health Data at EU pilot, on thinking about how to actually implement these things. And TEDAS 2, following up on TEDAS 1, of course, is then is a joint action that's just starting and which will be key in providing further details. So their deliverables to us will be, for example, guidelines on dataset descriptions. So when a holder notifies their data sets to the health data access body, how to describe the data sets, how, when they're then getting aggregated into catalogs, how those should work, these kinds of things. So plenty of questions, including many of those that were already mentioned in other presentations today. But TEDAS 2 is kind of one of the main pillars for generating input there. There are some others. Below they've got Quantum, so project on data quality and utility label. But this is so basically what TEDAS 2 will provide. That is one part where input is going to come from. And next slide, indeed, thank you. So that was on the practical side. Now on legal side, actually spelling things out in details, there are many empowerments for implementing and delegated acts in the text. And the work from these projects will, of course, also inform our thinking about how to make things work in detail. Next slide, please. So here, this is then, because this event today is mostly about secondary use, that's the list of all those implementing and delegated acts in secondary use. The ones in bold have an earlier deadline for us as Commission. Those we need to adopt by entry into force +2. So, for example, what does that mean? The one with the template for applications, requests, and decisions. So how would a data user actually ask for the data? Those templates must be available at +2, keeping in mind that the actual applicability of Chapter 4, which is what they would rely on, is +4. So 2 years before it actually starts going, these requirements are set out. And then, for example, the national EHDS can start building the application portal so that on entry into force +4, they just flip the switch, go live, and everything has been prepared. And if you see those are indeed the ones that require further also simply procurement and building work afterwards. So, for example, the requirement for the secure processing environments, of course, we need to set them out, and then actually the EHDS need to build them. So that is what is coming, what is on our plate here in preparation. And next slide, please. And now a question from the audience might probably be, so how can we feed in here in this process? So I mentioned the TEDAS 2 part. They will have public consultations on the milestones leading to the deliverables. As you've seen from the list 2 slides ago on what they'll be dealing with, they're going to have lots of things. And so they're also not going to come all at once. There will be waves, and we will publicize that in due course so that all kinds of stakeholders can provide their input there. Then that is on TEDAS 2. TEDAS 2 also has an external advisory board with stakeholder representatives to feed info in. And they're also doing a stakeholder forum. So on that one, I abuse this event to give you all a small save the date, 31st of January next year, and it's going to be a hybrid event. So no travel budget needed. That was on the TEDAS 2 side. On implementing delegated acts, that of course will be under our standard better regulation rules. So you can expect the usual public consultations on draft acts that we always have. Then again, on implementation, I see a question in the chat about the rules to establish the health data access bodies. What is needed there? So what our text says is member states shall establish HDAPs. These are the tasks of HDAPs. Here are some requirements on them, for example, on conflicts of interest and their avoidance, of course. And so the act establishing an HDAP would be a national law. This is it's the same construction as we have in GDPR for the establishment of the data protection authorities. Setting out, they must be there. Here are their tasks, some of their competences, but of course there is a certain filling out needed in national law to actually establish them, maybe situate them organizationally in the whole public administration structure. And because Federico mentioned the point on resources, we also have an obligation on the member states to provide indeed the sufficient resources to the HDAPs that they can actually fulfill all of their tasks. And the process of setting up the HDAPs is also something that we'll be looking at as the Commission when doing these progress reports that I mentioned earlier on how preparation for the application is going. I will take a breath, see, and this is then basically it on how are we going to spell out the details and how can you make your voices heard in there. So I am done with this slide for now. And thank you for your attention so far. And I think we made up some time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owe. Indeed, we have some time. Although, yeah, the last minutes I want to also give to Federico, as we promised him also some time to reflect on the industry position here on what we just heard on implementation. I also have a dozen of questions, but I think we definitely go into the second webinar where we definitely have to cover more subjects. But yeah, I would like to give the last minutes to you, Federico. Maybe if there are some further questions in the chat, we can also maybe quickly elaborate on them. But feel free to jump in.
I think there is enough to talk for a few hours and a bit more. So from an industry perspective, first of all, I think everyone welcomes this initiative. I think that the starting point that's been too quickly lost during the discussions has been the potential benefits of having these sort of initiatives, also in terms of this rising awareness in Europe regarding the need for greater competitiveness of the European Union. And this type of initiatives, which is ambitious, can provide a competitive advantage for companies and researchers operating in Europe. So it's definitely a welcome initiative, something that we should keep in mind even when we discuss the details and all the more difficult aspects that we'll need to address and the challenges in the future. Regarding some of these challenges that are already starting to pop up in the horizon, and we've discussed a number of them, I think one of the key challenges will be how to address possible fragmentation within the Union, as there have been, as a result of the compromise text and the negotiations, there have been some movement from the initial proposal of the Commission, which was much more straightforward and with a clear vision, into a more hybrid level of national and European level harmonization on a number of topics. We've mentioned also the consensus mechanism, opt-in, opt-out, genomic data has been highly discussed and debated on this as well. So how to address this sort of fragmentation, how to ensure that we don't have inequality of access to this data and then services, both for companies but also for patients, just because of the geographic location, thus creating different classes of operators and patients within Europe. I think all of these are important questions. And finally, in addition to these geographical fragmentation, there is also an increase into the stratification of the legal and regulatory landscape that may also provide concerns in terms of possible additional bureaucracy and cost for companies needing to navigate a more complex ecosystem. There is an interplay between the existing legislation frameworks, GDPR and others, that have provided some confusion and are creating some gray areas that we need to be clarified. So I think the overall comment on my part will definitely be one of optimism. I think it's a great opportunity that can translate in the future into a competitive advantage for companies in Europe. But there is also some risk of it becoming not only detrimental in terms of not achieving the intended benefits of the EHDS, but even adding new burdens to companies operating in Europe. So I think there is a lot of work on it, and we'll be happy to follow the discussions and the future webinars on it.
Thank you very much, Federico. Yeah, indeed, we would like to spend also a little bit more time maybe indeed on the international data transfers and the IP and the opt-in, but there's not, yeah, we're running a little bit out of time, but indeed this is something that we worked on in the past as well. As you know, the original Commission proposal didn't have an opt-out or an opt-in. Well, at the end, of course, you cannot deny European citizens to opt out from having their data used, but indeed have it in a harmonized way with the version we have right now, and especially that you talk about, Federico, the genomics and genetics data. There is a little bit of a backdoor in the current legislative text to introduce even opt-ins, and we know that Germany, Austria, Netherlands are thinking about doing that indeed. Germany because of the constitutional matters as well. The fear is a little bit that, especially in rare disease cases where data is already rare by default, or basically any other data that people, not in the case of rare diseases, but maybe young people of minority groups, or they just opt out or opt in from having their data shared, and what's eventually the worth of the data sets, is it representable at the end? So that's why I think it's important to have to strike a good balance there. I'm also looking at the Commission. I'm not sure whether the Commission is also thinking about at least give some guidance on how the opt-out should be implemented. It will be indeed the member states who will be having the biggest responsibility, but at least some guidance on that issue, because it's something that I also hear from our membership keeps returning.
Part of what we're looking at in these projects is indeed this is the whole spectrum of implementation. So they will also be looking at what are ways to make an opt-out work. And since basically our project partners, there are organizations in the member states who very often are very likely to be designated as an HDAP later on. So there is kind of a building consistency in that level. The other thing I can there, of course, only say is that for your concerns on representativity of data sets, that's precisely why the Commission proposal did not have a dedicated opt-out. We said that with the safeguards that we provide there, there is actually no need for that. And also for all the comments that the data protection authorities had in the joint EDPB-EDPS opinion, one thing they did not call for was an opt-in, opt-out. And finally, on the opt-in, I think it's quite clear that during the discussions, particularly on Parliament side, there was talk of how far does it go to an opt-in, and that is not what the legislators agreed on in the end. It doesn't say it's opt-in. The whole point of the EHDS is that it is not opt-in.
Absolutely. We have reached the end of this webinar, I'm afraid. And I would, I think there's definitely enough food for thought and definitely enough food for further discussion, if I can call it like that. I would like to thank all my speakers. First of all, thank you for this update and this overview and implementation. Zina, of course, also I'd like to thank you for running us through the text, and Federico for your extensive elaboration on how the industry views the EHDS. There's certainly more to the discussion, and I'm already looking forward to the next one. This webinar was just to scale the surface. We talked about the text, we talked about implementation a little bit, and in the next one we'll definitely dig deeper into what's necessary to implement the European health data space. So thank you very much, and I'll catch you on the next one. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.